The rain hammered against the windows of Twickenham Stadium as thousands of rugby fans streamed toward the exits, their voices still echoing with excitement from the match they'd just witnessed. But in a quiet corridor beneath the stands, a moment was unfolding that would ripple through the highest circles of British society. A moment that began with a simple act of defiance from an unlikely source. Sarah Mitchell had been a Royal Protection Officer for 8 years, trained to blend into the background, to see everything while appearing invisible. She'd stood guard over prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and members of the royal family through countless events. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what she was about to witness, or the choice she would have to make in the seconds that followed. As she watched the Duchess of Cambridge approach the hospitality area, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The subtle shift in body language from the event organizers, the way conversation seemed to halt mid-sentence, the deliberate turning of backs. It was happening again. Another carefully orchestrated snub, designed to look accidental, but executed with surgical precision. What happened next would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about duty, loyalty, and the power of standing up when it matters most. In a world where protocol ruled everything and stepping out of line could end careers, one guard's split-second decision would quietly shift the balance of power and prove that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. The morning had started like any other for Sarah Mitchell as she reviewed the security briefings for the Rugby World Cup final at Twickenham Stadium. The venue buzzed with an electric energy that only came with such prestigious sporting events, and the presence of multiple royal family members meant security protocols were at their highest level. Sarah had been assigned to Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, a role she'd held for the past 18 months and had grown to respect deeply. As Sarah conducted her final sweep of the royal hospitality area, she couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow certain members of the royal family wherever they went. The media had been particularly harsh in recent months, and Sarah had witnessed firsthand how these pressures affected the people she was sworn to protect. The Duchess, in particular, had faced an unprecedented level of scrutiny that seemed to go beyond the usual royal coverage. The hospitality suite at Twickenham was a masterpiece of British elegance, with panoramic views of the pitch and carefully curated guest lists that read like a who's who of British society. Politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and senior members of various sporting organizations mingled over champagne and canapes, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum that mixed with the distant roar of the crowd outside. Sarah positioned herself strategically near the entrance, her trained eyes constantly scanning for potential threats while maintaining the invisible presence that was her trademark. Catherine arrived precisely on schedule, her presence immediately brightening the room in a way that Sarah had observed countless times before. The Duchess had a genuine warmth that couldn't be manufactured, a quality that made people feel seen and valued regardless of their status or position. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, engaging in conversations that ranged from rugby tactics to charitable initiatives, her knowledge and genuine interest evident in every interaction. What Sarah began to notice, however, was subtle but unmistakable. As Catherine moved through the hospitality area, certain key figures seemed to find reasons to step away just as she approached. Conversations that had been animated moments before would suddenly wind down when she joined a group. The chairman of the Rugby Football Union, whom Sarah had seen warmly greeting other royal family members throughout the day, managed to be perpetually engaged in urgent phone calls whenever Catherine was nearby. Sarah's training had taught her to observe patterns, to notice anomalies that others might miss. What she was witnessing wasn't the natural ebb and flow of social interaction. This was coordinated, deliberate, and designed to send a message while maintaining plausible deniability. Someone, or multiple someones, had decided that Catherine should be given the cold shoulder, and they were executing this plan with the kind of precision that suggested careful orchestration. The first major incident occurred during the official photographs. The various dignitaries and VIPs were being arranged for group shots that would appear in newspapers around the world the following day. Sarah watched as the photographer, clearly following instructions from someone in authority, consistently positioned Catherine at the edges of groups or managed to capture shots where she was partially obscured by other participants. When Catherine naturally moved to more central positions, as protocol would normally dictate for someone of her rank, the photographer would call for adjustments that inevitably pushed her back to less prominent spots. Lady Margaret Thornbury, a longtime fixture in royal circles, and wife of a prominent conservative peer, was particularly obvious in her machinations. Sarah had observed Lady Thornbury at dozens of events over the years, and knew her to be a master of social warfare, capable of delivering devastating snubs with a smile. Today, she seemed to be orchestrating much of the subtle hostility directed toward Catherine, using her influence with other attendees to create an atmosphere of exclusion that was sophisticated in its cruelty. The tipping point came during the match itself. The royal box at Twickenham was arranged according to strict protocol, with seating positions reflecting rank, relationship to the crown, and the nature of patronages held by various family members. Catherine, as patron of the Rugby Football Union and Rugby Football League, should have been seated in the front row with optimal views of the action. Instead, Sarah noticed that she had been placed several rows back, with her view partially blocked by other attendees. More concerning was what happened when Catherine attempted to move closer to the action during particularly exciting moments in the match. Other spectators in the royal box, following what appeared to be predetermined social cues, managed to block her movements with seemingly innocent adjustments of their own positions. When she stood to cheer a particularly impressive play, those in front of her remained seated, forcing her to sit back down to avoid appearing inappropriately enthusiastic. Sarah felt her jaw clench as she watched these calculated microaggressions unfold. In her 8 years of royal protection, she had seen many things that challenged her sense of fairness and justice, but she had always maintained her professional distance. Her job was to protect her charges from physical harm, not to involve herself in the complex social and political dynamics that surrounded the royal family. But watching Catherine navigate this minefield of deliberate slights while maintaining her composure and dignity was testing Sarah's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The match itself was thrilling, with England mounting a dramatic comeback in the final 20 minutes to secure a narrow victory over South Africa. The crowd erupted in celebration, and even in the royal box, the atmosphere should have been one of jubilation and national pride. Catherine's genuine joy at England's victory was evident as she applauded enthusiastically and exchanged excited comments with those around her. But Sarah noticed that her attempts to share in the collective celebration were met with polite but distant responses from other royal box occupants. During the post-match presentations, when players and officials were invited to meet the royal party, Sarah observed yet another layer of the coordinated snub. While other members of the royal family were introduced to team captains, coaches, and key rugby officials with great fanfare, Catherine's introductions were perfunctory and brief. Several officials who should have been eager to meet the patron of their sport seemed to have pressing engagements elsewhere whenever she approached. The England captain, Marcus Thompson, a veteran player known for his intelligence and leadership both on and off the field, seemed genuinely confused by the social dynamics he was witnessing. Sarah could see him looking around uncertainly as officials guided him away from conversations with Catherine toward other members of the royal party. His confusion was shared by several players who clearly didn't understand why their patron wasn't being given the prominence that her position warranted. As the formal part of the day concluded and the group prepared to move to the post-match reception, Sarah made a mental note of everyone who had participated in the day's campaign of exclusion. The list was longer than she had initially realized, and included some surprising names, people she had previously considered to be allies, or at least neutral parties in royal family dynamics. The coordination required to pull off such a comprehensive social ambush suggested planning that went well beyond spontaneous personal preferences. The reception was held in one of Twickenham's most elegant function rooms, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the now-empty stadium and the London skyline beyond. The guest list was even more exclusive than the hospitality suite, limited to senior rugby officials, major sponsors, government ministers with sports portfolios, and select members of the royal family and their closest associates. Sarah positioned herself near the bar area, where she could observe the entire room while maintaining easy access to Catherine should any security concerns arise. What unfolded over the next hour was a masterclass in social exclusion disguised as a celebration. Catherine moved through the reception with her characteristic grace, but Sarah could see the subtle signs of strain beginning to show. The slightly too bright smile, the way her hand occasionally touched her pearl necklace, a nervous habit Sarah had noticed during other stressful situations, and the almost imperceptible quickening of her pace as she realized that genuine conversations were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The breaking point came when Sir Edmund Hartwell, the newly appointed chairman of Sport England and someone who owed his position partly to royal patronage, actually turned his back on Catherine mid-conversation to greet someone else. The gesture was so blatantly rude that several other guests nearby stopped their own conversations to stare. Even by the standards of the subtle warfare that had characterized the day, this was a bridge too far. Sarah felt something snap inside her as she watched Catherine's face briefly register the hurt before she composed herself and moved on to another group. The Duchess had endured hours of calculated slights with remarkable dignity, but Sarah could see that the cumulative effect was taking its toll. More importantly, Sarah realized that she was no longer willing to stand by and watch it happen. As Catherine approached the area where Sarah was positioned, their eyes met briefly. In that moment, Sarah saw something she had never seen before in all their time working together. A flash of vulnerability, a momentary crack in the armor of royal composure that revealed the human being beneath the title. It was a look that said more clearly than words ever could, "I know what's happening, and I don't know how much more of this I can take." She had spent her entire career maintaining professional boundaries, following protocols, and staying in her lane. But standing in that reception room, watching a coordinated campaign of cruelty unfold against someone she had come to respect and admire, Sarah realized that some situations demanded more than professional detachment. Sometimes, she thought, duty to basic human decency had to take precedence over duty to protocol. As the reception continued around them, with conversations flowing and laughter echoing off the elegant walls, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do or how she was going to do it, but she knew that the time for passive observation had passed. The question now was not whether she would act, but how she could act in a way that would make a difference without destroying her career, or, more importantly, without making things worse for Catherine. The seeds of defiance had been planted, and as Sarah continued to watch the social drama unfold around her, she began to understand that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance come from the most unexpected sources. Tomorrow, she decided, would be different. The question was whether she had the courage to follow through on that decision when the moment came. The sleepless night that followed the rugby match was unlike any Sarah had experienced in her career. She lay in her small flat in Putney, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. Every slight, every calculated snub, every moment of deliberate exclusion seemed magnified in the darkness. But more than that, she couldn't shake the image of Catherine's face during that brief moment when their eyes had met. The vulnerability, the weariness, and the quiet dignity in the face of such orchestrated cruelty. Sarah had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to maintain emotional distance from the complex personal and political dynamics that surrounded her work. Royal protection officers were trained to be like pieces of furniture, present when needed, invisible when not, and always neutral. But something fundamental had shifted during those hours at Twickenham, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about duty, loyalty, and what it meant to serve with honor. As dawn broke over London, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career and, though she didn't know it yet, influence the very dynamics she had witnessed the day before. She wouldn't wait for another public humiliation to galvanize her into action. Instead, she would use her unique position and knowledge to quietly begin leveling the playing field. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. Monday morning brought news of an impromptu visit Catherine would be making to a children's hospital in South London. A charitable engagement that had been arranged with minimal advance notice due to a cancellation in her schedule. These last-minute appearances were often the most challenging from a security perspective, but they also presented unique opportunities for someone who understood the media landscape and social dynamics as well as Sarah did. Sarah arrived at the hospital 2 hours before Catherine's scheduled appearance, ostensibly to conduct advanced security preparations but actually to put the first part of her plan into motion. She had spent her Sunday researching the hospital, the specific ward Catherine would be visiting, and the local media outlets that might cover the event. What she discovered had reinforced her determination to act. The children's ward Catherine would be visiting had been struggling with funding cuts for months, and several programs that provided art therapy and music education to young patients were on the verge of being discontinued. The hospital's communications director, Maria Santos, was a passionate advocate for the children, but had been fighting a losing battle against bureaucratic indifference and media outlets that seemed more interested in royal gossip than substantive charitable work. During her advanced preparations, Sarah struck up a conversation with Maria, carefully probing to understand both the hospital's needs and the media dynamics surrounding Catherine's visit. What she learned confirmed her suspicions about how these events were typically managed. The usual royal correspondents had been notified of the visit, but their interest seemed perfunctory at best. More concerning was the fact that several journalists who had been particularly critical of Catherine in recent months had specifically requested access to the event. Sarah realized that this visit, like so many others, was being set up to generate negative coverage or, at best, bland acknowledgement that would quickly be forgotten. The real stories, the impact of Catherine's patronage, the importance of the programs she supported, the genuine difference her advocacy made, were being lost in a narrative that seemed determined to diminish her contributions at every turn. That evening, Sarah made her first truly unauthorized decision. Using her personal phone and a carefully constructed email account that couldn't be traced back to her official role, she reached out to several journalists and photographers who specialized in social issues and charitable work, rather than celebrity coverage. She provided them with background information about the hospital's programs, the specific challenges facing the children's ward, and the timing of Catherine's visit the following day. Sarah was careful not to reveal her official position or to provide any information that could compromise security protocols. Instead, she positioned herself as a concerned hospital volunteer who wanted to ensure that the important work being done at the facility received the attention it deserved. She crafted her messages to emphasize the human interest angle, the children who benefited from the programs, the innovative therapies being provided, and the real-world impact of charitable patronage when it was thoughtfully applied. The response was immediate and encouraging. 3 separate outlets expressed interest in covering the visit from the perspective of the charitable work rather than royal watching. A photographer who specialized in healthcare issues requested permission to document the art therapy session that Catherine would be attending. A social issues reporter from a respected magazine wanted to write about the broader challenges facing children's hospitals and how royal patronage could make a meaningful difference. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made London look like a postcard. Sarah accompanied Catherine to the hospital, maintaining her professional demeanor while internally monitoring how her behind-the-scenes efforts were unfolding. The standard royal correspondents were present, as expected, but Sarah noticed with satisfaction that her additional contacts had also arrived and were already speaking with hospital staff about the substantive work being done with pediatric patients. The transformation in coverage was immediate and dramatic. Instead of the usual shots of Catherine shaking hands with administrators and cutting ribbons, the photographers Sarah had contacted captured her sitting cross-legged on the floor with children, engaging naturally in their art projects and listening intently as young patients explained their creative work. The journalists focused on the real impact of the programs rather than fashion choices or royal protocol. Most importantly, the children themselves were given voices in the coverage. 7-year-old Emma, who was undergoing treatment for leukemia, explained to a reporter how the art therapy had helped her express feelings she didn't have words for. 12-year-old Marcus demonstrated the music composition software that had been funded through charitable donations facilitated by royal patronage, playing a melody he had written about his dreams of becoming a professional musician despite his physical challenges. Catherine, freed from the usual constraints of formal royal visits, was able to engage more naturally and meaningfully with both the children and the staff. Sarah watched as the Duchess's genuine passion for child welfare and education shone through in ways that the rigid protocols of typical engagements rarely allowed. The conversation about funding challenges, therapeutic innovations, and the measurable outcomes of different intervention programs demonstrated a depth of knowledge and commitment that went far beyond ceremonial appearances. But Sarah's most significant intervention came during the lunch break, when she overheard a concerning conversation between 2 of the regular royal correspondents. They were discussing how to frame their coverage of the visit, and their approach was exactly what Sarah had feared: focus on a minor protocol deviation where Catherine had hugged a child who was crying, questioning whether such physical contact was appropriate, and speculation about whether her emotional responses to the children's stories indicated some kind of personal instability. The story they were constructing would have turned a genuinely meaningful charitable engagement into another opportunity to criticize Catherine's approach to her role. It was exactly the kind of coverage that had made the previous day's Rugby Snub possible, creating a narrative that justified exclusion and dismissal. Sarah made a split-second decision that went against every rule in her professional handbook. She approached the two correspondents and, identifying herself as a palace protection officer, provided them with detailed background information about the therapeutic programs they were witnessing and their measurable impact on patient outcomes. She explained the careful thought that went into Catherine's interactions with the children, the consultation with child psychologists about appropriate boundaries, and the training all royals received about working with vulnerable populations. More importantly, she provided them with context about the broader challenges facing children's health care and how sustained royal patronage could create opportunities for innovation and expanded services that wouldn't otherwise exist. She spoke knowledgeably about funding mechanisms, partnership development, and the way that high-profile advocacy could influence both public policy and private philanthropy. The transformation in their approach was immediate. Faced with an authoritative source who could provide substantive information about the real work being done, the correspondents shifted their focus from manufactured controversy to actual impact. Their questions became more sophisticated, their interviews with hospital staff more meaningful, and their overall framing of the visit more substantial. By the end of the day, Sarah realized that she had fundamentally altered the media narrative around Catherine's charitable work, at least for this one engagement. The coverage that emerged over the following days was unlike anything Catherine had received in months. Instead of focusing on fashion, protocol, or manufactured controversy, the stories highlighted the real difference that thoughtful royal patronage could make in addressing serious social challenges. The Children's Hospital received inquiries from potential donors within hours of the coverage appearing. The art therapy program that had been facing cuts received enough pledged funding to continue for another year. Most importantly, other hospitals began reaching out to explore how similar therapeutic programs might be implemented in their own facilities. But Sarah knew that her actions had consequences that went far beyond this single engagement. She had deliberately violated the boundaries of her role, used her position to influence media coverage, and intervened in dynamics that were supposed to be above her pay grade. In any other context, such actions would be considered serious professional misconduct that could end her career. What surprised her was how little she cared about those potential consequences. For the first time in her career, she had used her skills and position to protect someone not from physical harm, but from the kind of systematic undermining that could be just as devastating in its own way. She had demonstrated that the narrative of exclusion and dismissal wasn't inevitable. It could be challenged, countered, and replaced with something more truthful and constructive. The real test would come in the days that followed, when the people behind the Rugby Snub realized that their campaign of social and media warfare was facing unexpected resistance. Sarah understood that her actions would not go unnoticed indefinitely, and that there would likely be efforts to identify and neutralize the source of this new dynamic. But as she reviewed the positive coverage of Catherine's hospital visit, reading articles that actually focused on charitable impact rather than manufactured drama, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her work for longer than she cared to admit. She had discovered that protection could mean more than just preventing physical harm. Sometimes it meant ensuring that good work received the recognition it deserved, that genuine contributions weren't dismissed or diminished, and that coordinated campaigns of exclusion could be met with equally coordinated responses. The question now was whether she had the skill and determination to sustain this new approach, and whether the changes she was implementing could create lasting shifts in the dynamics she had observed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, and Sarah was beginning to understand that her real test was just beginning. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about going to work the next day. She had found a way to use her position and skills for something that felt meaningful and important, and for the first time since the rugby match, she believed that change was not only possible, but already beginning to happen. The backlash came swiftly and from multiple directions, though not in the way Sarah had anticipated. Rather than facing direct confrontation about her unauthorized media outreach, she found herself dealing with something far more sophisticated. a systematic campaign to neutralize her influence and isolate Catherine from the kind of positive coverage that had emerged after the hospital visit. Within a week of the children's hospital engagement, Sarah began noticing subtle changes in how Catherine's schedule was being managed. Charitable visits that would typically generate positive media attention were being quietly rescheduled or relocated to less accessible venues. High-profile events where Catherine's expertise and genuine passion could shine were being reassigned to other members of the royal family, often with explanations that seemed plausible but felt suspicious to someone who understood the deeper dynamics at play. More concerning was the pattern Sarah observed in staffing changes around Catherine's engagements. Longtime palace employees who had demonstrated genuine loyalty and competence were being transferred to other roles, replaced by newer staff members whose allegiances were less clear. The press officers who had previously worked to secure meaningful coverage for Catherine's charitable work were being assigned to other duties, substituted by communications professionals who seemed more interested in managing image than promoting substance. Sarah realized that her actions had triggered a counter-response from the same network of influence that had orchestrated the Rugby Snub. But rather than confronting her directly, which might have exposed their own coordination, they were working to systematically undermine her ability to support Catherine while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. The situation became crystal clear during a planning meeting for Catherine's upcoming visit to a secondary school in East London that was pioneering innovative approaches to mental health support for teenagers. Sarah sat in the corner of the conference room, officially present for security briefing purposes, but actually listening to a master class in bureaucratic sabotage. Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, a senior communications advisor, who had recently been assigned to Catherine's team, was methodically dismantling every aspect of the visit that could generate positive coverage. The timing was moved to coincide with Parliament's announcement of education funding cuts, ensuring that any media attention would focus on political controversy rather than charitable innovation. The student presentations that were to be the centerpiece of the visit were reduced to brief, formal speeches that would provide minimal opportunity for genuine interaction. Most problematically, the media advisory that went out emphasized royal protocol and fashion expectations, rather than the substantive mental health initiatives that Catherine would be examining. The journalists invited were primarily royal correspondents with little background in education or mental health issues, rather than specialists who could understand and convey the importance of the work being done at the school. Sarah watched this systematic undermining with growing frustration, but she also recognized that her opponents had made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to contain her influence, they had revealed the extent and coordination of their network. The same names kept appearing across different contexts: Lady Margaret Thornbury advising on guest lists, Sir Edmund Hartwell influencing venue selections, Mrs. Pemberton controlling media narratives. What Sarah was witnessing wasn't random bureaucratic dysfunction, but a deliberate campaign involving multiple institutions and influential individuals. More importantly, she realized that their very success in coordinating these efforts had created vulnerabilities she could exploit. The same communication channels they used to orchestrate their campaign could be infiltrated. The same social networks they relied on for influence could be turned to her advantage. The same media outlets they sought to control could be approached through alternative pathways. Sarah's counter-strategy began with intelligence gathering. Using her position and security clearance, she started mapping the relationships, communication patterns, and decision-making processes that enabled the ongoing campaign against Catherine. And so, she discovered that the coordination was even more extensive than she had initially suspected, involving not just individual actors, but institutional policies that had been quietly modified to create systematic disadvantages. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that several of the recent negative stories about Catherine had been based on information that could only have come from sources with access to internal palace communications. Someone within the royal household itself was feeding unflattering details to journalists, providing the insider perspective that made the stories seem credible and authoritative. Rather than attempting to identify the specific source, which would have been both difficult and potentially dangerous to her position, Sarah decided to use this knowledge strategically. She began carefully planting false information in different communication channels, creating unique details that would allow her to trace exactly how information was flowing from internal palace sources to external media outlets. The results were illuminating and disturbing. Within days, she could see how carefully crafted misinformation was making its way through specific pathways to particular journalists, confirming both the existence of the leak and the sophistication of the operation she was fighting against. But this knowledge also provided her with the tools she needed to begin her counter-campaign. Sarah's first major intervention came during the East London school visit that Mrs. Pemberton had attempted to sabotage. Rather than trying to work within the official communications framework, Sarah bypassed it entirely by reaching out to mental health advocacy groups, education specialists, and youth organizations that had existing relationships with the school. She provided these groups with detailed information about the innovative programs they would witness during Catherine's visit, explaining how these initiatives represented scalable solutions to mental health challenges facing young people across the country. She emphasized the research backing the school's approaches, the measurable outcomes they had achieved, and the potential for royal patronage to amplify successful models to other institutions. The response was immediate and powerful. Mental health professionals began requesting access to the visit not as casual observers but as potential collaborators interested in implementing similar programs. Education researchers wanted to document the methodologies being employed and their effectiveness. Youth advocacy groups saw an opportunity to highlight successful approaches that could influence policy development. By the time Catherine arrived at the school, the dynamic had been completely transformed. Instead of the perfunctory coverage Mrs. Pemberton had orchestrated, the visit was attended by specialists who could understand and articulate the significance of what they were witnessing. The students, rather than delivering formal speeches to an audience of royal correspondents more interested in protocol than substance, found themselves explaining their experiences to mental health professionals who asked informed questions about their therapeutic journey. The coverage that resulted was unlike anything Catherine had received in her years of charitable work. Rather than focusing on superficial aspects of royal visits, the stories explored the real impact of sustained advocacy on policy development and program implementation. The school's innovative approaches were examined as potential models for addressing the mental health crisis facing young people nationally. More importantly, the visit generated concrete outcomes that extended far beyond media coverage. 3 other schools requested consultations about implementing similar programs. A major children's charity announced new funding for mental health initiatives in educational settings. Parliament's Education Committee scheduled hearings on innovative approaches to student mental health support, specifically referencing the programs Catherine had highlighted. But Sarah's most significant victory came when she realized that the positive momentum from this visit had created opportunities to reverse some of the earlier sabotage. The success of the school engagement had generated internal pressure within Palace Communications to capitalize on the favorable coverage, leading to requests for similar approaches to Catherine's other charitable work. Mrs. Pemberton, faced with clear evidence that her management style was producing inferior results, found herself being questioned about her communication strategies. The stark contrast between the superficial coverage her methods generated and the substantive impact achieved through Sarah's alternative approach was becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah began to understand that her individual acts of defiance had evolved into something much larger and more systematic. She was no longer just protecting Catherine from isolated incidents of sabotage, but was actively building an alternative infrastructure for supporting her charitable work and public engagement. This infrastructure included networks of specialist journalists who understood substantive issues, advocacy groups that could amplify important messages, professional organizations that could provide expert context, and charitable institutions that could demonstrate real-world impact. Most importantly, it included a growing number of Palace staff members who had become aware of the coordinated campaign against Catherine and were quietly working to support her success. The transformation was evident during Catherine's next major engagement, a symposium on early childhood development that brought together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers from across Europe. Instead of being marginalized or subjected to the kind of subtle undermining that had characterized previous events, Catherine found herself at the center of substantive discussions about research findings, policy implications, and innovative program development. The symposium had originally been designed as another opportunity for symbolic royal involvement with minimal substantive contribution, but Sarah's behind-the-scenes work had transformed it into a genuine intellectual exchange, where Catherine's extensive knowledge and passionate advocacy could be fully utilized. The participating experts, rather than treating her as a ceremonial figurehead, engaged her as a knowledgeable colleague with valuable insights about implementation challenges and practical solutions. The success of the symposium created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the event itself. Research collaborations were established, policy recommendations were developed, and funding commitments were secured for innovative early childhood programs. More importantly, Catherine's role in facilitating these outcomes was acknowledged and celebrated by the professional community in ways that made future marginalization much more difficult. Sarah realized that she had accomplished something she hadn't initially thought possible. Through persistent strategic action, she had not only protected Catherine from ongoing campaigns of exclusion, but had actually strengthened her position within the charitable and professional communities that mattered most for her work. The network of influence that had sought to diminish Catherine's contributions now found itself competing against an alternative network that actively supported and amplified her efforts. But Sarah also understood that her success had escalated the conflict rather than resolved it. The people behind the original Rugby Snub had not given up their campaign. They had simply been forced to adapt their strategies in response to her countermeasures. The real test would come when they regrouped and launched their next phase of operations, armed with a better understanding of the resistance they now faced. As she prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond professional satisfaction. She had proven that coordinated campaigns of exclusion and undermining could be effectively countered by equally coordinated responses based on substance, expertise, and genuine commitment to meaningful outcomes. The quiet shift in Catherine's favor was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming a measurable reality that would be increasingly difficult to reverse.